Well, again, welcome everyone. And tomorrow is Mother's Day here in the United States, a day that's been set aside to remember and to honor our mothers. Honoring our mothers and our fathers is the fifth of the 10 commandments. It's also the only one of the 10 that comes with a specific promise. Today, let's take a look at the origin of Mother's Day. Then we'll look at some famous mothers in the Bible and how we might honor our mothers, not just on Mother's Day, but every day. Let's begin with the origin of Mother's Day. Now, when I first began to research Mother's Day, I began to find references that claimed that it originated with the worship of the Mother Goddess. That's Ashtoreth, Diana, the Queen of Heaven, that bunch. Now, while we do see that this has happened, especially just in the distant past, that's not the origin of our Mother's Day observance here in the United States. Now, in the past, the Church of England celebrated the Virgin Mary on what they called Mothering Day. That was on the fourth Sunday of Lent. In the 1600s, the church broadened the scope of Mothering Day to include all earthly mothers as well. However, the Puritans who came to America did not observe any type of Mother's Day. In fact, there was no day officially devoted to mothers here in the United States for hundreds of years. Now, in 1876, Anne Jarvis was teaching her class. Now, her 12-year-old daughter, Anna, was in that class. Anne was teaching about notable mothers in the Bible, and ended her class that day with a prayer that someday someone would found a memorial day for mothers. Well, that prayer really affected Anne's daughter, the 12-year-old Anna Jarvis. Now, later as an adult, after her mother's death, Anna went on a campaign to have a day designated to remember our mothers. Beginning in 1907, Anna sent letters to anyone who might be able to influence President Roosevelt to declare a national day to remember our mothers. Now, in large part due to Anna's efforts, individual states began having Mother's Day celebrations, but there was no national day of observance. A resolution to designate a day to remember our mothers was rejected in the Senate in 1908, but Anna never gave up. As Anna relentlessly continued to promote Mother's Day, the idea did begin to gain popularity. And eventually, on May 8th, 1914, Woodrow Wilson designated the second Sunday in May to be Mother's Day, a special day set aside to remember and honor our mothers. The cause that Anna Jarvis spent a good part of her life promoting finally was realized. Ironically, Anna Jarvis never married and was never actually a mother herself, even though she's responsible probably for Mother's Day in the United States. But as Mother's Day climbed in popularity, commercialism took hold. Sales of greeting cards, candy, and other gifts were marketed for Mother's Day. And this was not what Anna had in mind for Mother's Day. In fact, she became fairly upset about this. And having spent a good part of her life to make Mother's Day a national holiday, Anna Jarvis spent the rest of her life fighting against what she believed was a commercialism of Mother's Day. And that's a brief look at the origin of Mother's Day here in the United States. It was always simply to honor our mothers. Now, the original inspiration for our Mother's Day came from Anna's mother when she read about mothers in the Bible. So let's take a look at some of the mothers found in our Bibles today. Let's start out with that. Well, let's talk about a proverbial woman. Now, she may not be a real person, but is presented as an ideal woman. You probably know about this. Let's turn to Proverbs chapter 31. That's Proverbs chapter 31. The woman described in Proverbs 31 is a wife and a mother. Now, she works hard and is wise. We'll see that. Again, Proverbs 31, starting in verse 10. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. The Contemporary English Version reads, her husband depends on her, and she never lets him down. Verse 12. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. So this man's trust in his wife is not misplaced. She's completely trustworthy. This mother also works very hard. Notice verse 13. She seeks wool and flax and works willingly with her hands. I can just imagine a woman weaving or knitting, making things for her family. Verse 14. She's like the merchant's ships. She brings her food from afar. Well, often I think she does do the shopping and gets all the best deals, right? Okay, verse 15. She rises also while it is yet night, and gives meat to her household and a portion to her maidens. Now, this mother is also the family's alarm clock, as I call it. She's the first one up in the morning, and I can remember my mother always getting up first and getting things ready for the rest of us as we went to school or to work. I remember it being very dark in the wintertime, and Mom would wake us up after she had our old wood stove roaring. I remember the red pipe of the stove glowing bright red. To be honest, it scared me a bit, but the warmth it put out on our cold house was very welcome. And of course, breakfast was always on the table. There was plenty for everyone. Let's drop down to verse 20. Verse 20. She stretches out her hand to the poor. Yes, she reaches forth her hands to the needy. So this mother's generous. I can imagine her children watch as she gives to others and does her work. They're learning from her example. How do the children react to this? Drop down to verse 28, if you would, verse 28. Her children arise up and call her blessed. The Bible in Basic English puts it this way: her children get up and give her honor. Her husband also, and praises her. So what does her husband have to say about her, about this Proverbs wife? He says, verse 29, many daughters have done virtuously, but you excel them all. In other words, you're the best wife ever, right? Okay. All right. Let's look at some other mothers in the Bible. Eve, of course, was the first woman to become a mother. Now, Genesis 3, verse 20 in the King James, I'll just read it, says, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Now, Eve means life giver or giver of life. Eve is the mother of all humans, except for Adam and herself. Without her, Adam would have been the only human on the earth, and none of us would have existed. So I'd say that Eve was a very important mother. Turn next with me, though, to Genesis, if you would. Let's look at Genesis chapter 17. That's Genesis chapter 17, and we'll look at verse 15. Now, Sarah, the wife of Abraham and the mother of Isaac, also comes to mind here. I think Sarah always gets a bad rap for laughing at the thought of her becoming a mother at her age. But remember that Abraham laughed too. It wasn't just Sarah. So again, Genesis 17, verse 15. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her, and give you a son also of her. Yes, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. What happened? Well, verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. See, Abraham laughed too. He fell on his face from laughing. I'm not sure if I would have or not, but anyway. And said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, that is 90 years old, bear? I think we know the answer to his questions was yes. And they named their son Isaac, which means laughter. Okay, very appropriate. And he brought his parents joy in their old age. So, all right, let's turn next to Genesis 21, verse 8, just a few pages over, if you would. We're still talking about Abraham and Sarah. Genesis 21, verse 8. As the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. Now, they had a great feast on that day, and I'll explain why in just a little bit. Children are said to learn most of their personality traits between birth and 5 years old. Apparently, some of the child's personality seems to be God-given, as the twins Jacob and Esau, they struggled with each other even in their mother's womb before they were born. In fact, their descendants, as we know, are still fighting to this very day. But much of a child's personality develops between birth and 5 years old. And this early childhood period is a special time of the bonding of the child with his primary caregiver. In most cases, this would be the child's mother. Now, because infant mortality rates were high in the days of Abraham, a child surviving until it was weaned meant the child was strong enough that he would likely survive to adulthood. And that was the cause for the celebration we just read about in Genesis 21, verse 8. A lot of children didn't make it that far. So let's turn over next to 1 Samuel chapter 1. Beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 1. Excuse me. Hannah was another mother in the Bible. Now, Hannah was the favored wife of Elkanah, but she had no children. This is a common theme, it seems, in the Scriptures, a beloved wife who is barren, and often another wife who can have children who ends up tormenting the childless wife, until later in life, God blesses the barren woman with a very special son. Well, this sort of happened with Sarah, with Rebekah, with Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, and we'll see here with Hannah. So again, 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 1, right there at the beginning, 1 Samuel 1, verse 1. I'll see if I can get these names right. There was a certain man of Ramathaimzophim, of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, and the son of Zuph, and Ephrathite. And he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And this man Elkanah, this man went up out of the city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. More about them in a little bit. Verse 4. When the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. And her adversary, who was her adversary? That was Peninnah. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. Let me read that again in the God's Words translation, verse 6. Because the Lord had made her unable to have children, her rival Peninnah tormented her endlessly in order to make her miserable. Verse 7, back to the King James. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. So Peninnah harassed Hannah to the point that Hannah would cry and not eat. Verse 8. That sounds awful. Verse 8. Then said Elkanah to her husband, to her Hannah, Why weep you, and why eat you not? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? I guess he was trying to make her feel better, but that didn't work. That wasn't enough. Verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. There's other translations say she wept bitterly. But we might notice that Hannah didn't seem to be complaining to others about her situation. Instead, she took her request to God. Verse 11. And she vowed a vow, and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your handmaid, and remember me, and not forget your handmaid, but will give unto your handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. So Hannah promised that if God would give her a son, she would dedicate that son to God. He would be a Nazirite. Verse 12. And it came to pass, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. In other words, Eli noticed that Hannah's mouth was moving, but she wasn't saying anything, at least not anything that Eli could hear. Verse 13. Now Hannah, she spoke in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she'd been drunken. So I guess it was a silent prayer. She was praying, not out loud, and Eli thought she was drunk. Okay, so verse 14. And Eli said to her, How long will you be drunken? Put away your wine from yourself. And Hannah answered and said, No, my lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not your handmaid for a daughter of Belial. In other words, a person of worthlessness. For out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken now. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant you your petition that you have asked of him. Verse 18. And she said, Let your handmaid find grace in your sight. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. So now Hannah stopped being sad and began to eat again. At this point, she believed that God would answer her prayer. Verse 19. And they rose up in the morning early and worshipped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house to Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about, after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord. Hannah kept her vow, and when Samuel was weaned, she took him to the prophet Eli, and dedicated her precious child to the Lord. Samuel stayed at the temple and served Eli. But God blessed Hannah for her faithfulness. And Samuel was her firstborn, but she also had 2 additional sons and 2 daughters. Of course, Samuel grew up to be a great prophet and judge over Israel after Eli died. Of course, that was because Eli's sons turned out to be, evil. But Samuel was of good character. Character I believe he learned at least in part from his mother Hannah when he was very young. What about the mother of Moses, Jochebed? Let's take a look at that in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 22. That's Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. Now the Pharaoh in Egypt had become afraid of the Israelites that had greatly multiplied in Goshen. He feared that their growing numbers might become a threat to his empire. The Pharaoh ordered the midwives to kill any male child that was born, but to save any girls that were born. But if you remember, that didn't work. You remember, the midwives told Pharaoh that the Hebrew women delivered their babies quickly, so fast that they didn't have time to get there. So they couldn't kill them, they were already born. So the Pharaoh ordered all the male children that were born at that point to be thrown into the river. So again, Exodus 1 verse 22. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Next chapter, verse 1. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to his wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived, and bare a son. And when she saw him that was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Well, I'm sure that Jochebed loved her son very much. She hid Moses for 3 months, but I suppose she realized she couldn't hide him forever. Verse 3. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes. Now, most translations call this a basket, but you know what it is, I'm sure. And daubed it with slime and with pitch, so it would float. And put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. So I guess we can make a case that Moses' mother did cast her son into the river, but in an ark or basket. Pharaoh didn't say you couldn't use an ark or a basket, right? Anyway, verse 4. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. So his sister was watching this. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. So Moses was rescued, you might say, from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 6. And when she had opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to you a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother, Jochebed. Verse 9. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. So Moses, after being hidden by his mother for 3 months, was cast into the river, as Pharaoh had commanded, of course, in a floating basket. Then Moses was rescued and adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, and then given back to Jochebed, Moses' mother, to nurse. Verse 10. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water. Read it to you again in the Contemporary English Version. Verse 10 says, And when he was old enough, she took him to the king's daughter who adopted him. She named him Moses because she said, I pulled him out of the water. So Moses was with his biological mother until he was old enough to go and become the Pharaoh's daughter's adopted son. And we know what happened after that, right? Story of Moses, sure. But there's no doubt in my mind that Moses' biological mother had a great influence on him. I suspect his godly character was already formed, and even life in Pharaoh's palace, around all those pagans, you might say, couldn't take that away from him, thanks to his faithful mother, Jochebed. By the way, the name Jochebed means Jehovah is glorious. Okay, let's look at one more example of a godly mother in the Bible. This time let's turn to Luke chapter 1, verse 26. That's Luke chapter 1. We'll go to verse 26. Luke 1:26. We already briefly mentioned Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, who was barren until in her old age, God blessed her with a very special son. Again, John the Baptist. But in Luke 1, verse 26, we see the visitation of an angel to Mary, a young virgin who will become the mother of a very special son. Again, Luke 1, verse 26. And in the 6th month, now this was Elizabeth's 6th month of pregnancy with John the Baptist. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And the angel came in unto her and said, Hail, you that are highly favored, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women. And when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and cast in her mind what manner of salutation this should be. I mean, what's this? To say that Mary was shocked would, I think, be an understatement. What do you think? Well, anyway, verse 30. And the angel said to her, Fear not, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you shall conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He shall be great. He shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. He shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Then said Mary unto the angel, How shall this be, seeing I know not a man? Now, I don't think that Mary actually doubted what the angel told her, but I'm sure she was wondering, how could this be? Let's see how the angel answers her in verse 35. And the angel answered and said to her, The Holy Spirit shall come upon you, and the power of the highest shall overshadow you. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of you shall be called the Son of God. And behold, your cousin Elizabeth, she has also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her who was called barren. So we can see God can do some amazing things. Of course, Elizabeth will be a mother too, to John the Baptist, as I said, verse 37. For with God nothing shall be impossible. And Mary said, Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to your word. And the angel departed from her. Well, here Mary declared herself to be a servant of the Lord. She was willing to serve in this most important role. Be it unto me according to your word. Mary submitted herself to God's will. Mary was very faithful. And think about it. She ended up suffering the taunts of people who assumed the worst in her. But even more than that, she suffered a pain worse than death for her mother. She watched her own young son suffer and die a horrible death. You know, mothers endure so much for their children. Someone once said, I'm not sure why they call the 24 hours or so before the baby is born labor. The real labor is the next 20 years. I can attest to that. Okay. Well, anyway, tomorrow has been declared to be Mother's Day in the United States. I know many other countries also celebrate Mother's Day on the second Sunday in May, while some mark the observance at other times of the year. But it's a time that's been set aside to honor our mothers for all they do for us. But what about honor? How do we honor a person? Let's look over, if you would, in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, if you would, in verse 12. That's Exodus chapter 20 in verse 12. You may recognize that. You know, the fifth commandment tells us to honor our mother and our father, of course. Let's look at Exodus 20, verse 12, where we'll read the fifth of God's 10 commandments. Again, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. You're probably familiar with this. Let's read it anyway. Fifth commandment. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. Again, this is the only of the 10 commandments that actually has a promise of long life if you honor your father and your mother. The 10 commandments are repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5. I'll just read the fifth commandment from there. If you'll hold on 1 second. Deuteronomy 5 verse 16 says, Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. So, same thing. So what's the definition of honor? What does honor mean? Well, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's a verb that can mean to regard or treat someone with admiration and respect, or to give special recognition to. Let's look at Leviticus 19 next, if you would. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 32. Leviticus 19, verse 32. We'll look at how our Bibles tell us to honor our elders. And I believe this honoring our elders would also apply to honoring our mothers as well. Honor's honor, right? So let's look at, again, Leviticus 19, verse 32. You shall rouse up before the hoary head, or the white hair, and honor the face of the old man and fear your God. I am the Lord. Read that again in the easy-to-read version. It says, show honor to old people. Stand up when they come into the room and show respect to your leaders. I am the Lord. Well, it seems that young people today aren't as likely to show respect to older people as they did when I was growing up. I remember a time whenever a woman came into the room, all the men would stand up. I don't see that much anymore. I suppose that's just one more casualty of our current social climate. Let's move over to Leviticus 20, verse 9, if you would. Leviticus 20, verse 9. And this passage will be referenced in the New Testament. We'll see that shortly. But how should we treat our parents? Leviticus 20, verse 9. Here's how we shouldn't treat them for sure. For everyone that curses his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother, his blood shall be upon him. So God's very serious about this. We should always speak respectfully to and about our parents, our mothers. Now, so far we've seen two things in Scripture to honor our parents: to stand up when they're seated, maybe until they're seated rather, and to speak respectfully to and about them. Both of those were in the Old Testament. Let's take a look at the New Testament. Let's go to Matthew, if you would. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 4. That's Matthew chapter 15, verse 4. And here we find Jesus is talking to those Pharisees again. He's trying to straighten them out like he always is. But let's read Matthew 15, verse 4. And of course, these are the words of Jesus Christ. Here's what he says. He's repeating what we just saw. For God commanded, saying, honor your father and mother, and he that curses father and mother, let him die the death. So again, Jesus reminds us to honor our mothers and fathers as well. I think he's reaffirming what we just read in Leviticus 20, verse 9. But notice verse 5. Now, giving to God, giving to those who do God's work is important, don't get me wrong. But what if our mother or our father has a need? Perhaps they need food, they need help doing something. So if we ignore their needs and don't help them, if we give what we could have given to them in need to the church, that's actually going to be wrong. I'd like to switch to the easy-to-read version for verse 5, and this is, again, Jesus condemning the Pharisees. Here's what verse 5 says in the easy-to-read version. It says, but you teach, to the Pharisees, but you teach that a person can say to their father or mother, I have something I could use to help you, but I will not use it for you. I will give it to God. You are teaching them not to respect their father, and I would say this would apply to our mothers as well. So you are teaching that it is not important to do what God said. You think it is more important to follow those traditions you have. So even though people might give to God, if they needed something to help their parents, and they failed to help their parents, that would be wrong. Verse 7. You're hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he spoke for God about you. These people honor me with their words, but I'm not really important to them. Their worship of me is worthless. The things they teach are only human rules. Our Bibles instruct us to take care of our parents, and that would, of course, apply to our mothers. Yes, God comes first, but we're not to neglect the needs of our brothers and sisters, and we're certainly not to neglect taking care of our mothers and fathers. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, for another look at this, one of my favorite passages. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. 1 Timothy 5, 8. No, we should be there for our mothers and our fathers. Actually, we should be there for our entire families and others as well, whether it means food and shelter or just being there for them when they need us. We should be there. We should never forsake them. Again, 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, I'll be reading from the International Standard Version this time. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. If anyone does not take care of his own relatives, especially his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Well, I don't think any of us want to be worse than an unbeliever. That's pretty bad. We want to always follow the commandments of Jesus Christ and honor and take care of our mothers and other loved ones as well. Let's go next to John 19, verse 25 as we get to the end here. John 19, verse 25. John chapter 19, verse 25. Here we'll find an example of how Jesus took care of his mother. Now, apparently Joseph, Mary's husband, was no longer living. I'm assuming that. At this point, Jesus, as her firstborn son, was responsible for her. Now, here we find Jesus crucified and near death. Again, John 19, verse 25. Now, there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by, whom he loved, that was John, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then said he to the disciple, that was John again, Behold your mother. So here Jesus committed his mother into the care of John. John was now responsible for taking care of her, for seeing that her needs were met. Finishing, John 19, verse 27. And from that hour, that disciple took her unto his own home. We see Jesus made sure that his mother was taken care of when he wouldn't be able to do it himself. Likewise, we too should provide for the care of our mothers when they're old or whenever they need us. Let's turn to Luke 2, verse 41 to see something else that Christ did. Luke 2, verse 41. Luke 2:41. Another way to honor our mothers is, particularly as children, to obey them, and to obey both our parents. Now here we'll find Jesus was left behind at the feast. His parents went back to find him. Luke 2, verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother knew not of it. I suppose they just assumed that Jesus was walking nearby with relatives. I suppose. Verse 44. But they, supposing him to have been in the company, I guess they supposed the same thing, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. And when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem, seeking him. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, that should probably read teachers, both hearing them and asking them questions. They that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why have you thus dealt with us? Behold, my father and I have sought you sorrowing. And he said to them, How is it that you sought me? Wist or understand you not that I must be about my Father's business? In other words, Jesus said, Didn't you know I'd be about my Father's business? But Jesus wasn't being defiant, but Mary and Joseph just didn't understand. Verse 50. And they understood not the saying which he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was subject to them. Contemporary English version reads, Jesus went back to Nazareth with his parents and obeyed them. Of course, Jesus is our example in all things, and we see that he obeyed his mother and his father. He honored his mother as well as his heavenly Father. Know that many of us today no longer have our mothers with us. Still, we can remember and honor our mothers, the care they gave us, for the love they showed to us, the times they tolerated us as children, or possibly sometimes as adults. But like our Heavenly Father and his Son, they always loved us, and they always will. While we certainly miss them today, we are very blessed indeed to know that our separation from them is only temporary. We will be reunited with them in God's great kingdom, where we will never be separated from them again. And we're so blessed to have that assurance from the words of our Bibles. To conclude today, in large part due to the work of Anna Jarvis, on May 8, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson set aside a day to honor our mothers. Mother's Day was to be observed on the second Sunday of May each year. That will be tomorrow. It seems to me to be a bit ironic that Anna Jarvis was never a mother herself, after all the work she did for Mother's Day. But she was inspired by her own mother to have a day each year set aside to remember our mothers. We saw how mothers in the Bible help shape the personalities and the character of their children. Great children, as it turned out in many cases, especially when they were young and often before they were even weaned. We saw mothers like Hannah, the mother of Samuel, Jochebed, the mother of Moses. Of course, we saw Mary, the mother of Jesus. And finally, we also saw how we should honor our mothers, that we should treat them with admiration and respect. We should give special recognition to them by standing up for them and speaking respectfully to and about them. We saw that we should take care of our mothers, especially when they're maybe too old or unable to take care of themselves. We saw that Jesus provided for the care of his mother right before he died. And we also saw that as a child, Jesus obeyed his parents, including his mother, of course. If it wasn't for our mothers, none of us would be here today, right? They bore us, They nurtured us. They taught us. And they loved us. They helped shape who we are today in a great way. So tomorrow, on Mother's Day, let's honor our mothers. But not only tomorrow, but all the days of our lives. Then it will go well with us, according to the promise. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. Thanks for everything, Mom. I love you.